Hi, everyone. It's very nice to be here. My name is Caroline, and I'm a PhD candidate in social work at Linnaeus University in Sweden, hence the nice bright color on my slide. And I'm here today to talk about silenced, invisible, and invulnerable masculinity, men subjected to heterosexual IPV from a Swedish context. And since I began my study, the number of studies in Sweden focusing on male victims is limited. Most studies have mainly focused on street crimes and violence targeting teenage boys and young adult men. And the selection of studies focusing on adult men subjected to heterosexual IPV is scarce, and all but one are comparative studies. And the media's interest in reporting on abused men and their experiences of heterosexual IPV is deficient in Sweden. The support for social intervention and interventions aimed at male victims is inadequate, and therefore abused men more often seem to turn to non-governmental organizations and secluded Facebook groups or other social media platforms for advice on where to go for help and support. And the public support system for men is limited, but it is changing today. And when I began my study, I envisioned difficulties in contacting men who identify themselves as having been subjected to violence by a female counterpart. So I systematically handed out information about my research at different organizations. It was then up to the men themselves to make contact, and recruiting this way I considered to be self-selective, and it also led to the snowball effect. And in total, I've interviewed 22 men, and besides individual narrative interviews, I've also had 4 group interviews with social services specialized IPV units and 2 non-governmental organizations specialized in men who's been subjected to violence. I need my papers. And it is through the men's narratives I have focused on how they reconstruct their gender identity and how they made sense of their experiences. And therefore, the purpose of my the purpose is to analyze the narratives of men's emotions and lived experiences of heterosexual intimate partner violence. I missed out a bit. Yeah, so the methodological approaches is narrative analysis, and I have this I've talked about. That one. I faced 3 different challenges while doing my interviews, and it was very obvious that the men were on a mission. They wanted to see me and speak to me, and they had something to tell. And what they had to tell was that they had a story. And this was very obvious because when I had to interrupt them during their talking, I noticed that they were on a specific timeline. So when I asked a specific question for clarification, I got a short answer, and then they redirected themselves to their timeline. And they also sought recognition from me about their experiences, and that what they had experienced was in fact okay and accepted, because it's not that accepted in society. And yeah, I mentioned that because my papers didn't work. So since this is an ongoing study and it's my dissertation. This is only tentative findings so far. And there is no mentioning of I have been abused by my wife or girlfriend in most interviews. And there is no mentioning or definition that they have experienced, what they have experienced is in fact violence. It is more customary that they try to neutralize the violence they have experienced by excusing, justifying, or prevaricating her behavior when trying to make sense of their experiences. And one may think that this is because they are not that familiar with the concept of intimate partner violence, but it is in fact the opposite. They are very well read and knowledgeable about intimate partner violence. And that made me think that they would not have any issues identifying themselves as victims, but they do. And the assumption about who is a victim and not differs, and according to society, the Swedish one, a victim must earn a status of victimhood, and that's what female victims have done. And for victims of IPV, there is a rather clear identity as a victim because there is an established social position which they can take on, even if they too have many difficulties accepting that identity. And it is rarely something that does not challenge or threatens their identity as a woman, while for men, it seems to be a reluctance of letting them obtain the status of victimhood. I have interpreted this as the main reason might be that it deviates from the hegemonic masculinity, meaning that there may be a risk for them to lose the male gaze as real men by society and the public in general. It can leave them feeling astray and somewhere in between or in betwixt identities, as well as with a marginalized or indefinite masculinity in which they may appear to be more vulnerable and invisible than before, which does not seem to be accepted. And most men mention situations in which they tried to end a relationship and how the women responded with threats such as, if you leave me, I will say that you have abused me, even though she knew and he knew that he hadn't done anything. And she would also add to that threat, whom do you think they will believe, you or me? And situations like these show that women are familiar with society's designed structures to help and support abused women of IPV. These women seem to be knowledgeable about their rights. They are accepted as victims by society and how they can use their knowledge and position to their advantage and use it to scare the men in doing what they want them to do. And this treatment continues making the men feel marginalized, ashamed, and scared that the woman will actualize her threats, which also makes them feel invisible and vulnerable in society. The commonality is that they face treatments such as skepticism, mistrust, and disbelief regarding being a victim of heterosexual IPV. It seems as if such treatment curbs the men's fear and shame that when seeking help and support, men must justify their stories to earn the status of victimhood, which may affect their preference to identify themselves as victims. Further, if they would admit to themselves, I am a victim, the risk of losing society's gaze as hegemonic men could contribute to double victimization in society. And it brings me to another reappeared theme in the interviews, which is the statement of how the women diminish the men's masculinity by using the phrase, you're not a real man. For instance, Noel's partner told him repeatedly, and one time told him this repeatedly, and one time he responded with, "I'm man enough to get you pregnant twice." And I asked, how did she reply to that? Anyone can do that. And how did that make you feel? It was once masculinity took a turn for the worse. Another man called Walter described how his personality and masculinity were attacked with degrading words by his partner. He was repeatedly told, "Fucking idiot. Fuck, you don't do anything for me. You're not a man." And Walter's story also includes how she could diminish his masculinity if he did not want to have sex with her when she wanted to, on her terms and conditions. And Walter told me that when she wanted to, then I had to do it because I'm a man. Even if you didn't want to, yes, I had to. There were times when I wasn't up for it. And she would say, "What the hell? If you don't fuck me, you're not a man." And how did that make you feel? I felt like an idiot. I felt like, no, I didn't know what to do, to be honest. I just felt like that I wasn't a human being, you know. I was something, a tool to her. That's how I felt. And due to Walter's experiences, he mentioned that he had seen a therapist who had told him, "You have to accept that she never loved you." And I asked him how he felt when hearing that, and he replied, "I thought it was really hard because I was like, what?" And the therapist continued, "No, she has never loved you. She doesn't know what that is. You must understand that, and I have understood that now." And I asked him, how did it make you feel when hearing that? Well, it's like a loss that I have thrown my life away, you know, like I'm nobody. And the phrase "I'm nobody" was not only used by Walter, but some also used the same phrase while others expressed the same meaning of it. When repeatedly hearing that you are not a real man or that you are nobody, I would have been surprised if the men would have told me that they had not become affected. But as it turned out, they were affected, and some described it as if they ended up in some state of limbo due to the feeling like nobody. And not knowing who they are, I have interpreted it as if these feelings can contribute to the men's avoidance of identifying themselves as victims. Further, being in a liminal position can also be one of the reasons for increased suicidal thoughts among abused men. And another theme that reappeared was how the men talked about their responses to the violence they experienced. Almost all mentioned the differences and significance prevailing gender roles and identities have for how they reacted or acted when subjected to violence or violent behavior. Most men claim that they had not retaliated despite the woman's coercive and controlling behaviors. Instead, they claim that they either tried to flee the situation or appease the woman to avoid worsening it. Most of them also mentioned that they did not have the option of defending themselves because they feared hurting her and that she would use it against him at some point and claim that he was the perpetrator and she was the victim. And from the narratives, it has also been possible to identify that the men feel a need to assert their innocence to avoid dismantling their masculinity, to maintain or reconstruct the assumed male gaze and hegemonic masculinity. And that's even though some already have and others are about to construct a new possible self. Thank you for listening.